I remember the first sound like a verdict, a long, wet tearing that threaded through the night and made the bunk room feel suddenly too small. For a moment I thought it was the hull, an old ship memory lodged somewhere collective and deep, but it was the ice itself, shifting and groaning like a living thing waking up under a heavy, indifferent sky. My throat closed. I lay there counting the spaces between the sounds, and in each space a memory of why I had come to this frozen nowhere stacked itself into place. The unpaid hospital bills back in Boston, the look on my mother's face the night I told her I was leaving, the promise I had made at my sister's bedside when she said, "Go before the world eats you." I had come because I needed to be necessary somewhere that mattered. I had come to the Belgian Antarctic expedition because the dark had become a room I could work in, not hide from. We called the place the Belgica Station in half-joking reverence to the old stories. Belgian flags, upended snowdrifts, and a stubborn little plaque bolted above the main hatch that someone kept polishing with gloved fingers. Captain Marcus Hale liked tradition. He wore his uniform jacket even when the heaters died because the jacket made him look like a man who could command weather itself. Dr. Evelyn Price was our chief glaciologist and my professional rival in an artful way. She had a precise coldness that matched the air here, and a habit of smiling like a scientist who had already calculated your next failure. Tom Rivera, the engineer, embalmed everything in sarcasm and duct tape. Sarah Brooks, our radio operator, could make the station sing with static stretched voices from the outside world, and when she laughed, the station felt less like a box and more like a community afloat on a white sea. I told myself, on the bus to the airstrip and again on the flight over the endless blue-white, that I was ready. I had the credentials, a PhD in paleoclimatology, a raft of publications no one outside our niche would ever read, and hands that did not flinch when they had to work with fragile core samples. But underneath my CV and those credentials there was something softer and more dangerous, an appetite for absolution. I had come to Antarctica not just to study ice, but to outrun the memory of a patient I had failed, the one who had died on my shift while I read charts in a lull between calls. The guilt had become a landscape inside me. I hoped the literal landscape might map some kind of route out of it. The first weeks were a study in small violences. The cold took the edges off of everything. Conversations shortened, days compressed into lightless hours punctuated by the duties that kept us alive. You learn the intimacy of survival quickly, how to knot a rope with numb fingers, how to dress in layers with the kind of methodical patience that feels devotional. I learned that my own breath could become visible not just in steam, but in the small, animal rhythm of staying conscious. We worked with the ice like sculptors and thieves, drilling, extracting, labeling, wrapping cores in thermal paper like newborns. At night we drank instant coffee that tasted like regret and read old novels on tablet screens because paper froze in the vents. Its Belgica had its routines and its secrets. There was, for instance, a narrow cave the local maps called the Meridian Rift, a place of hollowed ice shelves where the sea wind had carved out an interior like a cathedral. Part of my job was to map and sample the rift's interior microclimates. Evelyn and I argued over the best instruments to lower. She preferred conservative redundancy while I liked to test boundaries, cut closer to the edge. Our quarrels were professional, but the tension between us soon acquired a private face. I began to feel watched in a gentle, precise way, as if my mistakes were being marked to a ledger only she kept. The first micro-hook came the night we found the slow gasp of methane trapped under a blue slab. We were lowering the spectrometer into a fissure when Sarah's light caught something not in the data sheets. A black hairline against frost. A line of deposits that suggested, not recent, but older, organic matter embedded in the ice. Evelyn's face changed. She stopped being a repository of cool hypotheses and became, for a few heartbeats,
a person seized by the possibility of rewriting a small corner of the world's history. "This shouldn't be here," she said, which is a kind of command in a scientist's language. We sampled that patch with trembling competence. Back in the station, the lab smelled like antiseptic and metal and the sharp electric anxiety of discovery. The tests came back ambiguous, so the belief that something anomalous might be sleeping in our field of ice tightened around us like a hand. It wasn't proof. It was enough. The papers I had back home would have sung if I could have fed them this caveat. A potentially distinct organic deposit, possible migratory residue, unknown dating. Language to be wielded carefully. Instead, it became a private ember between Evelyn and me, something we both touched at odd hours, a shared secret that both allied and estranged us. I also had another, quieter subplot. A series of letters from my sister, Mai, that arrived in tacky, delayed packets via the supply ship schedules. She was pregnant and scared and living with a menagerie of small debts, and every letter was an ache of my absence. In one, she wrote, "You think the cold is outside, Claire, but sometimes I think it sits in my bones the same way your silence sits in the house." The letters softened me in the perverse and useful way that someone out there could still be hurt by my choices. I wrote back with promises I couldn't fully believe, because somewhere beneath the duty to the mission, there was an urgent,
selfish comfort to being the person who could be counted on to escape. If not for them, then certainly for me. The second microhook came after the storm, a whiteout that lasted 48 hours and left our satellite links sputtering with phantom images. The storm peeled everything to its essentials. Only the barest necessities of motion and survival remained. During the quiet after, when we went out to measure the wind scours and put our instruments back on their little pedestals like makeshift altars, Tom found footprints alone, and then, beyond them, a smear of red on the snow. We thought at first of seals and shark-thin whales beneath the ice pounding against themselves in panic. But the smear was not animal. It was blood. We tracked the prints with a dread that feels like a physical thing, cold hands clamping a rope more tightly not because of the rope's function, but because the mind needed something to do with its worry. The prints led to a narrow shelf where the ice had cracked open into a throat of darker blue. The blood tied itself to a story none of us wanted to tell. An injury on the sea ice, a fall, the wild and lonely violence of an environment that does not forgive inattention. For a night, the station pulsed with the things we feared. Fractures in our perimeter, the possibility of a scavenging predator, or worse, the idea that someone had been here before us and not survived. We found no body. We found instead an old marker, a small metal tag with a number and a date, half buried and pitted. It belonged to a survey team from decades ago. The tag made the station feel populated by ghosts that wore official colors and dates. The tag suggested that this place had been measured, annotated, abandoned, and then reclaimed by time. It felt like a warning and a benediction. The third microhook came when the radio hummed raw static and then, briefly, a voice from Chile that mentioned iceberg movement on a corridor we used to send our supply drone.
Sarah's face went white, and her hands turned into the image of someone trying to hold on to air. "They're calling adrift," she said, which meant that the ocean under our station, which we trusted as the steady foundation beneath our instruments and our routines, was moving in a way we had not accounted for. Marcus called an emergency meeting where we stacked the consequences like cards, and watched them fall with a calm that was only possible because we had rehearsed this sort of pivot in our heads 100 times over. That night, in the cramped safety of the commons, I thought about mortality in that stripped-down, utilitarian way that scientists do, not as a poetic threat, but as data to manage. Still, data has a weight to it. Our survival calculations showed we could ride the drift if we secured the station, but the sea is a cat that can choose when it wants to bat the furniture off the shelf. We went to sleep with the feeling of being slightly unmoored. And then there was the moment when death was not a theoretical set of numbers, but a thin, hot thing at my shoulder. The sea ice shelf we were sampling had a core that was sounder than we expected. I was outside with Evelyn alone because her instruments required the precision of 2 steady hands. The wind had a mind that afternoon, and it moved like a judge walking between rows. We were lowering the auger when the ice sighed beneath us. It made a sound like a held breath letting go. For a second, I saw the world as if through a lens cracked by a gunshot. Everything focused on the edge between white and blue, an eye painted by cold. Evelyn moved first, always the quickest when data or danger was involved, and shouted. Her voice was swallowed up by the blank. The ground at my feet gave way like the start of a bad dream. The shelf slotted down and out, and the world reoriented on a new axis. I felt myself slide and my glove catch on frost, fingers closing on a lip of ice, as if the planet had offered me a single thread to hold. My legs disappeared into a hunger of blue and water and cold that wanted to trade my life for a different geometry of the landscape. For a few seconds, which condensed into a lifetime, everything simplified into the mechanical facts of rescue. My breathing, Evelyn's grip, Tom's rope, the radio crackling like a distant storm. I remember the pressure of my gloved hand on the ice, the sharp, worried grunt of Captain Marcus as he anchored the line, and the smell, an impossible metallic smell that the cold distorted into something like copper and the smell of seaweed. Around me, noise dissociated. The rain of sweat from exertion turned to tiny ice beads on my forehead. I saw my life at an angle. Mai's last letter, the patient in the hospital bed I hadn't been able to save. The small failures stacked like frozen dishes in a sink. The world narrowed to a strip of hope, the rope cutting through the air between me and the men who had not yet let go. They pulled me back with the mechanical faith of a team that understood the arithmetic of survival. When my feet hit the shelf again, my knees refused to hold me, and I laughed, a sudden, ugly laugh that had no humor in it. I felt, in a naked physical way, the proximity of death, not as a literary device or a lesson to be learned later, but as a hot, bright, tactile sensation. It smelled like salt and old metal and the wool of my own sleeves. That close, death is not even a question of morality. It is simply an event that might have happened, and you are left with the residue. We sealed the fissure that night with measured fury. The crew was quieter in the days after. Even Evelyn's edges had softened. Perhaps she had looked at death too, and found it not an abstraction, but a neighboring house you could see from your window. For me, the near miss stitched something new into my understanding of being necessary. Not the heroics I had imagined before I left Boston, but the raw clarity that I would always be a fragile, temporary arrangement, held in place by the choices of others and the random decisions of weather. There were other strange things we saw, auroras that collapsed like curtains behind the sky, the flash of leopard seals as they vaulted through the water looking like dark punctuation marks, and the way light refracted through layers of ice
to create images that felt like faces pressing against the inner panes. Once, in the far distance, I thought I saw the silhouette of a person walking along a ridge, and I ran blind across the snow, only to find that the figure was an illusion of rock and frost. The mind here misfires easily, knitting patterns into nothing, because the brain prefers meaning to emptiness. By the end of my first season, the Belgica felt less like a station and more like a vertebra in my body. It had weight, it had shape, it swung with my moods. The team had formed its own tender economies. Who made coffee too strong? Who kept extra chocolate hidden in desk drawers? Who sent ridiculous postcards to the others' families during the exchange of supply lists? We kept living small human things while the world around us continued to pretend it had nothing invested in our survival. And yet the expedition had started to pull at a seam I hadn't anticipated. During a routine core analysis, we found a pocket of gas trapped in ice thousands of years old that matched patterns more rapidly changing than the timeline suggested it should. When we quintuple-checked the calibrations and ran the tests again, the numbers refused to be tidy. Evelyn's hands shook when she wrote the anomaly into the log. "This will change modeling," she said, but what she did not say aloud was that it might change how the world understood its own future. At night, under the mechanical hum of the heaters, I would think of the patient I had failed, and the way my hands had hovered uselessly over the chart, and I would consider the strange arithmetic of responsibility. Here, our mistakes had immediate physical costs. At home, mistakes cost reputations or procedural rebukes. For the first time, I could see a kind of redemption that was not theatrical but practical. To be useful in a place where usefulness meant literal safety. It was not enough to chase absolution. It was enough to be, in small ways, the rope someone else could hold. And yet, as the station hummed quietly on the night before our resupply run, doubt crept in with a slow, domestic persistence. Had I come here to be necessary, or had I come to be forgiven? The difference mattered because forgiveness suggests change that happens without consequence. Necessity insists that you pay attention to the ledger of real-world outcomes. I was beginning to understand that this place would not absolve me of anything I had not earned through responsibility, and that sometimes the price of proving yourself was simply surviving long enough to do the work. When the supply plane finally arced over the white horizon the next morning, we gathered on the sled perimeter to watch the shadow cross the ice. The wind had laid its hand gently on the world, and the sun was a white coin, elegant and indifferent. I felt that same tightening in my chest, the old fear that everything I had tried to outrun would catch up to me in the thin air. If death had been near once, it could be nearer still. And if the ice was holding a story as old as the planet, then it was also holding a future I could not yet read. We were safe in the mechanics of immediate survival for now. But something in the way Evelyn kept looking at our data, an almost private insistence, told me that the Belgica had more to teach us than any of our calculators had predicted. The world in this place kept giving and taking. Our job was to make sure we gave back in ways that mattered. I didn't yet know what we had uncovered in the ice. I only knew that it would change the way we argued in the lab, the way Marcus assigned patrols, the small economies of trust between us. I only knew that for the first time in a long time, I had been forced to look at death not as a rumor, but as a hand at the back of my neck. And in looking, I found a strange, clarifying courage. I didn't sleep the night the supply plane circled us and vanished again into the white. The winds had been wrong, the drift too wide, a corridor of unstable air sending the pilot into a holding pattern before he finally radioed that he would have to return to Punta Arenas.
It meant we had at least another 2 weeks alone with our data, our dwindling stores, and the growing suspicion that we were sitting on something the ice wanted us to forget. We reconvened in the commons around 0600, the heaters rattling like old bones in the walls. My hands wrapped around a mug of weak coffee, not for warmth, nothing was warm here, but for the reminder that my fingers were still attached to me. Evelyn stood at the head of the table, the anomaly printouts fanned out in front of her. Tom leaned forward on his elbows. Marcus was half shadow, half commanding presence. Sarah clutched her radio headset in both hands, as if she could will it to conjure a world that wasn't smothered in ice. "This changes everything," Evelyn said quietly, tapping a graph that dipped and rose in a way the planet hadn't done for tens of thousands of years. "Whatever was trapped down there, it wasn't supposed to be released yet." And just like that, the room felt smaller. Marcus spoke next. "Explain it for all of us." Evelyn nodded once. "We didn't just find ancient methane in those cores. We found something else, a microbial signature that predates known sequences. Not alien, not sensational, just old, too old, and active." Active. The word crawled into my spine and lit up old nerves. It wasn't dangerous, not in the Hollywood sense. Nothing dramatic, nothing apocalyptic. Just a microscopic reminder that the past is always waiting for its moment to return. "It's waking," Evelyn added, "because we disturbed it." The quiet that followed wasn't fear. It was responsibility pressing its full weight onto all our shoulders at once. "We need verification," Marcus said.
And containment.
"Both," Evelyn agreed. "Immediately." I looked at the chart again, the oddly elegant little spike on the curve. "How long until it spreads beyond our samples?" Her eyes met mine, steady and honest. "It already has. Just trace amounts. It's not harmful, but it's unstable. It reacts quickly to warmth. If we don't secure it, the data will degrade." Which meant all of this, the anomaly, the discovery, the truth, could vanish into noise if we didn't act now. A storm building on the horizon sealed the decision for us. We would go back into the Meridian Rift. One last time. I suited up in silence, layering gear like armor. If death had stood at my shoulder once, she would gladly try again. But something inside me felt anchored now. I wasn't here running from the ghost of a patient I failed. I wasn't here chasing redemption. I was here because the world had asked something of me, and for once in my life, I understood the assignment with clarity. Evelyn loaded the containment cylinders. Tom checked the ice anchors twice, muttering the way he always did when he was scared. Marcus prepped the sled. Sarah stayed behind. Someone had to keep the station awake and listening. Before we left, she took my hand. "Come back," she whispered. I squeezed her fingers. "We will." But even then, I wasn't sure. The rift was a mouth carved into the world, swallowing sound and reason. The sky above it was bruised with the coming storm, and the air tasted like metal and static. We descended carefully, the rope line humming through our gloves. I remembered the first time I'd come here, how I'd felt watched, how the ice had seemed to breathe. Now I knew better. It wasn't breathing. It was shifting. Waiting. The deeper we went, the more the light fractured into impossible blues, layers of time stacked like stained glass. Our crampons clicked against centuries. Evelyn stopped every few feet to test the readings,
her breath fogging her visor. I followed close behind.
every sense sharpened to a painful point. When we reached the cavity, the original dig site, the silence pressed in. The gas pocket had collapsed slightly from the pressure change. A dull, clouded sheen coated the ice walls. And there, faint but unmistakable, was the black, organic streak we had first found. Except this time, it was larger. Spread outward in hair-thin branches, delicate as veins. "Oh, God," Evelyn breathed. "It's reacting to the initial exposure," I whispered. "Then we need the sample now," Marcus ordered, "before this whole chamber destabilizes." We set to work. The cold burned through my gloves as I drilled, more careful than I had ever been in my life. Tom steadied the cylinder. Evelyn monitored temperature probes, her movements sharp and practiced, but threaded through with adrenaline. Then the crack came. Not loud, not violent. A single, sharp note. The floor beneath us shifted half an inch, maybe less. But in Antarctica, half an inch is the difference between a mission and an obituary. "Wrap it up," Marcus barked. We sealed the sample. I slid it into the insulated container. My heartbeat skittered like something trapped. The ice pinged again, louder. A web of fractures snaked across the shelf near our feet. Tom swore under his breath. "We gotta move." But the rope line, our anchor to safety, had twisted during the shift. The path we'd descended was now angled wrong. To climb back, we'd have to cross the newly fractured section. Marcus tested it with his boot. It held. Barely. "Single file," he said. "Slow and—" The world broke open. A slab of ice pitched downward, dropping into the blue abyss below with a thunder so deep it rattled inside my lungs. Marcus jumped back. Tom slipped but caught himself. Evelyn grabbed the wall. And I fell. Not fully, not into the void. My right leg plunged through the weakened shelf, the rest of me slamming against the ice with bruising force. Pain flared up my thigh. My breath left in a single hard gasp. "Claire!" Evelyn screamed. I clung to the edge, fingers numb, the abyss yawning beneath me. The blue darkness looked almost soft, like velvet. A beautiful, fatal invitation. Tom threw himself flat and crawled toward me. "Don't move, I've got you." He reached my arm. Our gloves slid once, a flash of pure terror, then locked in place. He pulled. I pushed, and the ice answered with another groan. For a moment, I knew exactly what death felt like. Close, patient, certain. But Tom didn't let go. He dragged me out in a frantic, graceless heave. I collapsed onto solid ground, gasping, shaking. Evelyn dropped beside me, her hands on my shoulders. "You're okay," she said roughly. "You're okay. Stay with us." Marcus scanned the fractures. "We're leaving, now." We backed out of the rift one agonizing inch at a time, each footstep tested, each breath loud in my ears. My leg throbbed with every shift of weight. Twice I had to stop, the pain white hot, but I didn't let them carry me. I needed to walk out of that place on my own. When the last rope cleared the lip of the chasm and the station came into view through the thickening storm, something inside me released. A knot I had been carrying for years. Inside, Sarah nearly cried when she saw us. Tom collapsed onto a bench. Marcus peeled off his gloves and rubbed his eyes. Evelyn immediately took the sample container to the lab. I sat on the floor for a long time before I trusted my legs to work. Sarah handed me a cup of instant cocoa. I drank it like it was the first warm thing on earth. When Evelyn emerged from the lab half an hour later, her face was unreadable. "We preserved it," she said simply. "It's stable. Whatever we discovered, the world will see it. You did it, Claire." Her voice wasn't cold this time. It was warm, proud, human. And in that moment, I realized it had never been her judgment I feared, only my own. The weeks that followed passed in controlled urgency. The anomaly held. The storm cleared. The supply plane returned. We loaded everything, the cores, the samples, the reports, into secure containers. Our work would go to labs in Europe, the US, South America. It would change climate modeling, microbial phylogeny, the understanding of ancient ecosystems. And I had changed too. My letters to Mai grew longer, softer. I admitted things I hadn't told her, about the patient, about the guilt, about how I thought coming here would erase the versions of me I didn't want to face. She wrote back, "You don't have to disappear to start over. You just have to choose the next version of yourself on purpose." The day we boarded the plane home, the Belgica station shrank into a dot of red against the infinite white. I pressed my forehead to the window and watched Antarctica fall away, still immense, still unknowable, still carrying secrets beneath her frozen skin. I had come here to outrun death and failure. Instead, I had met them both. I had looked into the ice and seen what it meant to be fragile and temporary, and how that fragility made us responsible for one another. Antarctica hadn't forgiven me. She had instructed me. And I was finally ready to return home and live like someone who understood the lesson. The engines roared. The sky opened. And I left the bottom of the world behind, alive, changed, necessary in a way I no longer needed to prove. The story wasn't about death after all. It was about choosing to live.